Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 13 after Tamar has been brutally raped by her brother Amnon, and now he sent her away, saying simply to his servants, "Get this thing out of here." And as you can see on the left side of the screen, she put ashes on her head, tore the long robe that she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. So that's our scene as we enter into it today. And just to get us up to speed here, I've been going over some of these questions on the right side of the screen. And if you haven't watched the introductory video for this section of 2 Samuel 13 and 14, I really encourage you to do so. There are a lot of these specific questions related to today's passage, but they will certainly come up again, as we'll see from some of these next time. But one of the ones that's in the background is, where are all the other brothers? And we'll look a little more closely at that in just a minute. We've also been seeing how these two chapters, 13 and 14, are closely connected with the two that preceded about Bathsheba and Nathan's little parable about the rich man, poor man, the ewe lamb, and the traveler there, connecting these, as well as the two stories themselves in chapter 13 and 14, tightly connected to each other. So we've been going over that to highlight that these are all stories about David's relationships with women that reveal much about him and about his sons. So as we've been looking at the chiastic shape of this whole first section from 13:1 to 21 from Fackelman, we're now in this bottom part here. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, the emphasis here on brother, 4 times, and this is one verse from Absalom's voice. And we're just going to look at this one small piece. This section here in the second half of the verse here in verse 21 is from the Septuagint. The Hebrew ends right here, so I'll have to look at that as well. But what I really want to focus on here is Absalom, because as you can see on the left side of the screen where I've highlighted it, although we're only looking at these verses, you can see the story is now about Absalom. It certainly was about Tamar, and Tamar was not just the passive victim as Dinah was in Genesis 34 in the rape by the prince of that group of people, Shechem there. She certainly spoke up and she's publicly noting her grieving and what she's been done. And this is out in public, as we can see. After this, she will go into Absalom's house. So this is part perhaps of what Nathan was telling to David. You did what you did to Bathsheba and Uriah in secret, but Yahweh now will do to you in public and before this very son. And so we'll look at that more as we go. So it's certainly about Absalom now, and it'll be about Absalom at the end of chapter 14. That was one of the parallels that we note here in the aftermath of both these stories. Absalom is there. There are also echoes of Genesis, and not so many in today's passage, but you can see here one of the parallels is David hears of the rape and does nothing, and Jacob heard of the rape of Dinah and did nothing. And perhaps there's more to there than just unattentive fathers. There are reasons that we looked at in the Genesis series for that, and I'd like to suggest, although some scholars suggest David is just passive and not aware of what's going on, that doesn't fit the character of David we've seen, who's been very shrewd and very aware of where his interests lie throughout. So as we begin to look at this passage, I want to note that what we know about Absalom. So if we look at this chart here showing David's women and children, we find out back here in 2 Samuel 3 that Absalom's name is listed within this set of people born to him at Hebron before he was king in Jerusalem. And note the one about Absalom is the only one that talks about who his mother came from. Son of Maacah, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur, and we'll connect that in just a minute. The only other one that was connected was Abigail, the widow of Nabal, although that's not about Abigail's background. We know nothing about where she came from in this case, other than the fact that she lived in Carmel, but connected with Nabal. And as we saw of Amnon of Ahinoam, who's likely to be Saul's former wife that David took, because that's what kings do. They take women from their men, among other things that they take. So this is highlighted back in 2 Samuel 3, and it's sitting there waiting for us to notice. As in 2 Samuel 5, when we hear, once he got to Jerusalem, he took, not named as how many, or just naming them all, more concubines and wives, or as I translated it, secondary women and primary women. I just copied this straight from the New RSV here, because this little passage here is not about the translation issue, but that's something we might keep in mind. And these are the names born to him in Jerusalem. We see Solomon is listed in there. Obviously, that hasn't happened in 2 Samuel 5. So this is meant to be a summary of his entire time in Jerusalem. And notice that Tamar is not mentioned in either of those lists, even though we heard more sons and daughters, suggesting they were earlier daughters, and Tamar is the sister of Absalom, and she's not mentioned there. So this is simply the description of sons, but it does say more sons and daughters, implying there was more than just Tamar. There were multiple daughters, or at least that one, and others here. Are any of these names possible daughters? Maybe, but none of them are ever mentioned again other than Solomon. And most of these are not mentioned again. The only ones that are mentioned are the ones I underlined: Amnon, who we've seen, and Absalom, and Adonijah, who'll be the one to try to fill the vacuum of the succession when David is seemed to be unstable and incapable of making the decision himself. So let's follow the Absalom story, having seen that he's kind of hidden in there, and the Bible does that kind of thing. Just like in Genesis 11, it hid the whole Lot and Sarai thing back there with Abram and then brought it up forward later. That's a common strategy, is to give us a little detail and hope that we can remember that. It's an example of what I've been trying to say throughout this Radical Bible series, of the importance of noting the context in which words and verses are put, because that reveals a lot to us. So this is a little exercise in that. So we'll see after this immediate scene here, after his confrontation with David, it says Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ahimaud here, a detail we don't hear there. We don't hear that Talmai's the son of somebody else, but now we hear that Talmai is the son of the king of Geshur. So Talmai is a prince, and Absalom would have been potentially a king in that land, and that's where he's gone, and he stays there for 3 years at the end of this. And then after that, we see that Absalom says to David, after the business with the woman of Tekoa, and Joab gets Absalom to return, he says, "Your servant speaking of himself, of course, made a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram. If Yahweh will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, I will worship Yahweh in Hebron. Notice not, I will worship Yahweh in Jerusalem, but if he will bring me back to Jerusalem, I will worship in Hebron." We'll get to that when we get to chapter 15. But it's already highlighting an element here that he's not willing to worship in Jerusalem, even if he comes back. So one of the connections I want to make here is suddenly now in chapter 15 we hear that Geshur is part of Aram. So we have to go back to chapter 8 and hear for a while the Arameans became servants to David and brought tribute after he defeated them and put garrisons among them in Damascus. We'll look at the map for a minute just to see that. But then we saw just before the Bathsheba incident, in the last narrative of a war that David is about, we hear this: the Arameans, who just a few chapters earlier had been serving David, arrayed themselves against David and fought, but David killed of them 700 chariot teams and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shabach, the commander of their army, the parallel with Joab, so that he died there. And neither Aram nor Arameans are mentioned again in 2 Samuel. So what this is highlighting, and we can look at the map here, is that Absalom, by going to Geshur and already being from Geshur, is already a rival to David. That if he's not going to succeed his father in Jerusalem, he may succeed his grandfather, or his grandfather's father, really, up here in Geshur, which you can see is part of this area of Aram on the other side of the Jordan River. And so the red lines here show the battle lines of the battle in chapter 10 that I was just referring to. And so by the time we get to our scene, we have no reason to think that Absalom's family are not fond of David and are aligned against him. And could David possibly be innocent of that? I doubt it. Many scholars are suggesting that what David does in letting Amnon get away with raping his sister and not doing anything about it, that leads to the scene we're looking at here, is because he's somehow naive or innocent or just unaware. But I'd like to suggest that's very unlikely given the character of David that we've seen. I was suggesting last video that one way to read this whole thing is that David has rightly seen Amnon and Absalom as potential successors in the place of the one that he really wants, which is the son Solomon from Bathsheba, and he's setting up a situation where Amnon and Absalom can both die and David not be deemed responsible for it, and Tamar is the sacrifice that requires that to be done, based on her own understanding of putting her hand on her head was what you do, according to Leviticus, when you're offering an animal in sacrifice. So from that reading, Tamar is the sacrifice that David is willing to allow his own daughter in order to clear the way for his son Solomon to succeed. Now, if that seems harsh and even Machiavellian, well, isn't that the character of David we saw just in the previous chapters when he was willing to kill one of his great supporters, Uriah, in order to cover up the fact that he took Bathsheba from Uriah and got her pregnant? So we accomplish nothing if we assume that David is a good man and we can't attribute to him dark motives. And it's not just David. It's the nature of monarchy. Many different cultures from that time and from later, from the time of Jesus and the Roman Empire, certainly show of emperors and kings who are willing to kill their wives and their own children to arrange the succession and the power arrangements the way they want to. And we know that starting in chapter 15, Absalom will be openly in rebellion against David. And so is it really realistic to think that in all the years that go on in this break, 7 full years, first the 2 years here, then the 3 when Absalom is with his grandfather, and then 2 more when he comes back and David refuses to see him, that for all that time, David doesn't understand that Absalom is waiting for his chance to take his father's place. So I'd suggest that if we assume that David is innocent here, we are not reading the text very carefully. So let's look back at the shape of this here, and we'll begin to look at just these short verses here. As my note below has, it's not clear where this is happening until the end of the verse, nor how long has passed. Westbrook adds below, in the vacuum created by David's abdication of his responsibility to restore both justice and place for Tamar within his house, as well as dealing with the dishonor created by Amnon, Absalom uses his power to take control of Tamar and to plot the death of the heir apparent. And that's certainly what we see here. Rudman adds from an earlier article, Absalom's address is the only kindness which Tamar experiences in the whole narrative. And Absalom may have many motives. We know at one level, we'll see in verse 22 in a moment, that the text tells us he won't speak to Amnon because Amnon raped his sister. And there's no question that that's true, but there are other motives that Absalom has that the text isn't telling us, but allowing us to infer based on what I just showed you and based on what we'll see, both in this scene and then what follows in the rest of the chapter and what follows in chapter 14. So her brother Absalom, I noted 4 times the verse, said to her, has Amnon your brother been with you? Mustn't Absalom know that? He can't be so innocent of what's been going on in this small situation, can he? Or maybe he doesn't know. Been with you here, as my note has, talking around the rape. He doesn't name it out loud, presumably to protect her dignity by not saying the horrible thing out loud. But then he silences her. And whether we hear this as a silence or something else, depends on which commentator we look to. So as we can see down below, Fackelman notes, my comment is Absalom seeks to silence her given the outcry in verse 19. But Fackelman notes Absalom does not want Tamar to take legal action. Absalom wants to take the law into his own hands. But what law exactly is that? We don't know of any law here except the Mishpat HaMelech, the justice of the king that was announced back in 1 Samuel 8, which is about kings taking. So we don't know about Leviticus or Deuteronomy or any law. Almost all of that is certainly written later and certainly not named here as known in the text. So whether it's about law or whether it's about his silencing her, it's not exactly clear. But he certainly has a plan. He refers to her as my sister there, and Amnon as your brother. So what is the relationship there? He tells her to be quiet because he is your brother. Is that suggesting that she's not the right person to challenge Amnon before David? Or something else? It's not 100% clear there, but he's certainly going to do it on her behalf. And he tells her with some irony and perhaps with some unfeeling, as Graham Old notes below, do not take this to heart. Or literally, as my note below has, do not set your heart on this word. And as Auld notes, it seems a very unfeeling choice of word given the heart play in the story. And as a further note below has, Absalom's mild reaction here is intended solely to camouflage and conceal his true intentions. And finally, my note below, quoting Richard Smith, rejecting the revenge theory as not supported by the text, and he says, quote, Absalom's dismissal of Tamar's feeling over being raped is reminiscent of David's callous dismissal of Uriah's death. So there's a few options. Are these kind words? Are these unfeeling words? Is it simply a dismissal and he doesn't care? Or does he care about her, but he's setting her up for his own form of vengeance? But we don't hear a response from her. Instead, we hear that the text says she remained, but using the word for settled, suggesting that she's moved into Absalom's house, and that's where she expects to spend the rest of her life because she has no prospects whatsoever. She's described as a desolate woman, from the word shum here, meaning deserted. And the word is used 70 times by the prophets, almost always for the abandonment of Jerusalem or the nation at exile. And so one way we can read this story, and this will come up again as we look at the little story that Joab puts in the mouth of the woman of Tekoa in the next chapter, is that this is all a little parable about the monarchy and exile. So let's look at my note down below and we'll see a little more of that. So as Bodner notes, quote, if Tamar remains desolate in his house, she becomes a living reminder of her shame, of Amnon's guilt, and the rightness of any cause Absalom may have, which would say in David's house. But my note below has further, as Tamar, the beautiful daughter of the king, becomes deserted because of lust turned to disgust, so will the Jerusalem temple, the beautiful product of the king. Thus, the rape by Amnon represents the abuse of the temple and the monarchy itself by those who selfishly ignore its holy purpose and use it to satisfy their lust. And that's certainly one level to read this. That Tamar, the palm tree, the fruitful one, and her desolation is an expression of the temple and of Jerusalem, which will happen, of course, in exile. And she remains in her brother Absalom's house. And as Halberstadt and Holmes note below, for the plot to succeed, Tamar has to stay sequestered in Absalom's house alone in silence. But she should be in her father's house. And David knows that Absalom taking his sister Tamar and putting him in his own house is certainly parallel to what we'll see later when Absalom takes David's secondary women and goes into them sexually on the roof of the king's house. Yet this is a challenge to David's authority over his daughter here and eventually over the people overall. But David doesn't seem to do anything at all. And that leads us to verse 21 here. Note it's parallel to Jacob's non-response in Genesis 34, but it's not quite the same. One of the rare occasions here where we hear David named, as my notes here show, he's been the king throughout, and you can see in the second part that we'll be coming to next, he's king, king, king all over the place. But now he's King David, highlighting these both king and father here. So when he heard all these things, or literally all these words, he became very angry. And that's where the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, stops, leaving an open question of exactly what he's angry about. Is it the rape? Is it the cover-up? Or perhaps because Absalom is playing father and king to Tamar by protecting her? The Septuagint, whether it comes to our rescue or not, is hard to say, but the New RSV now presents this like it's part of the text, so we have to really consider it part of the text here. But this is all added from the Greek. And I translated it more literally over here in contrast to the way the New RSV has it, as, and he would not cause pain to Amnon's spirit. He loved his son that was his firstborn. And that really highlights that he's trying to protect Amnon from the Septuagint's perspective. But as I was highlighting earlier, in the absence of this, it could well be that he's leaving Amnon to be killed by Absalom. And that's exactly what David is setting up, to alienate the two brothers from each other and just wait patiently for Absalom to dispatch Amnon, and then to wait even more patiently for the army to dispatch Absalom, which of course is what will happen. Septuagint adds because he loved him, which makes the only place in the entire book that the text says that David loved anybody. But the Masoretic text never says that. Because he was his firstborn. And that recalls what I was noting from chapter 3, describing Amnon as firstborn, the opposite of Jacob, who favors his lastborn sons. But he's not going to favor Amnon very much. And we have to wonder if the Septuagint is really getting this right here. Is it because he loved Amnon, or because he's just waiting for Absalom to dispatch him? The text simply won't say that. The word for firstborn in the Greek, protokatos here, we can see was used in anticipating Jacob and Esau, and then about Jacob and Esau, where the firstborn doesn't get the advantage, and that's Esau, of course, and it goes the other way around, and Amnon's not getting any advantage here either. But when we look at the sequence here, Absalom is not next. Chileab is next, the son of Abigail, always named as the widow of Nabal of Carmel, and we hear nothing about Chileab, nor nothing about these others, the fifth and the sixth ones here. But we ought to hear about Chileab, ought we not? Ought that not to be a concern of us? If Amnon is going to be dispatched by Absalom, then Absalom is the next, if the order of birth is what makes for a king, which it does in more traditional dynasties. But as we saw back in 1 Samuel 8-10, the call of a king is someone Yahweh chooses and the people affirm. So the text kind of slides in here, are reading the monarchy as if it's a traditional dynasty, and not helping us to remember that none of David's sons should necessarily be the king next if it wasn't for 2 Samuel 7 and Nathan's prophecy that one of David's would be on the throne forever. So we'll stop there for now, and we'll pick this up. We'll go one more verse here. Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, a figure of speech for not talking to him at all. As Falkman notes below, he suggests he did not treat him in a hostile way, but he hated him, which is to say he didn't do anything publicly to show how much he was against him, but wouldn't everyone know? And especially since we're going to see very soon that he's not there, but that's only after Absalom's dead. For Absalom hated Amnon, no surprise there, and again, because he had raped, or literally because he had oppressed or abused. There is no specific word for rape, but that's certainly the word, as you can see in my note below from above. So we'll pause there for the 2 years. I won't take 2 years to respond, and we'll pick it up when Absalom invites all of the king's sons to a sheep shearing party. See you for that next time. Bye.